I am now going to show you the second watercolor technique. For this one, you're going to need your watercolor paint, your water, your brush, and a little thing of salt. So for this activity or this background, you're going to do kind of the same thing that you did with the wet on wet. But you don't have to do just wet on wet. What I like to do is a kind of a combination of wet on wet and then just the wet paint on the dry paper. So you can start off with just putting some water on your paper and then adding your color to that section, or you can just paint directly onto the paper. So either way you want to do it, and add whatever colors you want. Again, you can do any colors you want. And then once you get your paint laid out where it's still wet before it dries, you want to take a little pinch of your salt and just sprinkle it right on top of your watercolor. Now with this, it needs to be wet. So you need to have really wet spots on your paper. If you do just like a streak of paint and it dries, then when you put the salt down, it is not going to absorb as much water. You see how those salt crystals are just kind of sitting there? You want the paint and the water to absorb into your salt. So you want to make sure you have plenty of water and paint on your paper. So if you want to start with that wet on wet technique, it actually may be easier for the salt, but it will work with just putting paint directly onto your paper without the salt or without the wet on wet technique. You just have to make sure you're applying the salt before it dries. And you can do that in all over your paper in any of the color paint. You can mix it. I'm just kind of wetting my paper so I can start adding my colors. And then just adding my salt. And you can put as much or as little on there as you want. The more you add to the wet part, the more the effect will take place. So when you're finished painting your watercolor and adding your salt, you're going to let this one fully dry. And again, you can let it dry all by itself, or you can use a hair dryer to dry it. Mine is now completely dry, especially where the salt is the thickest, okay? Because if it's not fully dry, then it will tear the paper. So now that it's dry, you are going to want to gently, and you might have to get a little bit harder, but you got to be careful of the paper. You want to gently just scrape that the salt and loosen it from where it is on the paper. I'm going to dump this down into the trash can. So make sure that you have something to dump the salt into as you're scraping it off. If you need to do it over the trash can, do it over the trash can. But as you start, and my paper is very, very soft, so be very careful. As you start to scrape the salt off, you will notice the effect that the salt has on the watercolor. I'm trying to get enough salt off. I think that I've got most of the salt off. So if you look really close in these areas where the salt was, do you see how it made those little starry type shapes where it's white? That was the salt absorbing the water and the color. So now you have all these really cool little places on your watercolor background. So here's another technique that you can use for one of your projects.